All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event. Thank you all for attending virtually. My name is Adrian Daub, and I'm the faculty director of the Clayman Institute. And we're so pleased to have Professor Ashley Farmer with us to share insights from her latest book, Queen Mother, Black Nationalism, Reparations, and the Untold Story of Audley Moore, published by Penguin Random House just a month ago, hot off the press. I got my copy at Green Apple Books in San Francisco, and a person reached for the book right after me and walked out and bought it. So this is a book that a lot of people are reading, and that's in bookstores everywhere now. Professor Farmer is a historian and scholar of Black women's history, intellectual history, and radical politics. She is currently an associate professor in the departments of history and African diaspora studies at the University of Texas at Austin. From 2013 to 2014, Professor Farmer was also a postdoctoral fellow here at the Clayman Institute. So it's really wonderful to welcome her back, albeit virtually, to this building and to this institution. Professor Farmer's first book, Remaking Black Power, How Black Women Transformed an Era, was published in 2017. Her scholarship has appeared in numerous venues, including the Black Scholar, the Journal of African American History. Her research has also been featured in several popular outlets such as Harper's Bazaar, NPR, and Teen Vogue. And her next book project is Watched, The Black Women Tracked by the FBI, A History of the Rise and Fall of COINTELPRO Through the Eyes of the Black Women J. Edgar Hoover Hunted. Now, before I turn it over to our speaker, please note that you are welcome to put your questions in the Q&A box throughout the talk. That is going to be the way we pose questions to Professor Farmer. At the end of the talk, Professor Farmer will be answering your questions, but I will be channeling your questions. And so, yeah, just feel free to add them to the Q&A as they occur to you. They will not be showing up for her. They'll show up for me, so there's no problem there. Also, I should mention, if you aren't already signed up for our Clayman Institute mailing list, please do visit our website to keep up to date with our research and with upcoming events. So thank you all for joining, and welcome, Professor Ashley Farmer.
Thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction. I know we have just about an hour, so I'm going to go ahead and dive all in. And good morning or good afternoon, based on where you are. And thank you for taking a little bit out of time out of your day to join me. Today, I'm going to talk about Rebel Archives, the life and legacy of Queen Mother Moore. This is both going to be a little bit of an introduction to her for those who may not know her, perhaps a little bit more in depth for those that do, and we'll talk a little bit about her life, but also about the process of researching her or doing, gender history, as it were. And I wanted to take a moment, though, and talk about the path to getting this particular book. As Adrian mentioned, I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Clayman Institute in 2013 and 2014. And it was there, sitting actually upstairs in the Clayman Institute, that I began writing the article that you see here, Reframing African American Women's Grassroots Organizing, Audley Moore and the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women. So this is where I first started to think about how to formulate the ideas that would become part of the biography. And it was in large part because of the space that the Clayman Institute gave me to think through her complicated and complex life that we'll talk about. As I moved from the Clayman Institute, I wrote Remaking Black Power, and Queen Audley Moore kind of bookends that book. It begins and ends with her. So she's been on my mind for quite some time. And then finally, as my career has advanced, I have written Queen Mother, Black Nationalism, Reparations, and the Untold Story of Audley Moore. So I think it's really important to ground oneself not only in the books and scholarship, but also in the places that have allowed for us to do this kind of generative history. So I just want to give just the briefest of overviews of Queen Mother Audley Moore. She was born in 1898 and she died in 1997. So she lived almost the entirety of the 20th century. And in that time, she was part of every major movement or moment in 20th century Black freedom movement. We're talking the 1920s in the Harlem Renaissance. We're talking the Depression in the 1930s. We're talking two world wars, World War I and World War II, the rise and fall of McCarthyism, the rise of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, and then the backlash from that through Reagan, Nixon, and on into the Bush and Clinton era. So it's absolutely astounding that someone that has that level of political breadth and depth is largely unknown before I wrote this book. And most people have said that she is quote unquote curiously absent from history. That's the term that most historians have used. But I found this when I was sitting back at the Clayman Institute many years ago, a really unsatisfying response. How can somebody who lived that long, that met people like Marcus Garvey, that started the modern reparations movement, that mentored folks like Malcolm X, people who were on stage, one of the few women featured at the Million Man March, for example, be so curiously absent from history? Even more interesting was the fact that when I was writing this other book, Remaking Black Power, that you see here, I interviewed probably 30 to 40 different activists, and almost every single person had a story about Queen Mother Moore. The story was this was the first person I learned about reparations from. The story was this is where I really learned to struggle. She taught me about the science and politics. This story was this is a model for how Black women kept organizing and staying in the game, largely when we think of Black political organizing as a young man's game. So I couldn't reconcile for myself how someone who was so pivotal and still living so much in other activist memories could be so absent from our history books. So there's a couple of other questions that came up that are at the core of the biography and also the work of doing gender history. One is, how does Moore help us understand Black nationalist ideology and practice? I surmise that part of the reason that she isn't so much entered into our kind of historical record is that, she was a radical through and through. She was not interested in integration. She was not interested in saving the American nation state. And I do believe this has had her be carved outside of our modern narratives of the freedom movement, where we're moving towards this quote, ultimately triumphant democracy, which we know is in fact not the case. The second question there is, what does the lack of research and writing about Moore tell us about the state of Black radical archives? The continual question was, when I was starting to write this book, was where are you going to get your source material from? Despite the fact that she lived for more than 100 years, and despite the fact, as you see, I'll go back real quick to this picture here. This is a picture of her in her actual home in Harlem. She was her own bibliophile, right? She collected her own memorabilia and her whole writing on its own. Nobody knows where any of this stuff is. And so I had to spend the better part of a decade trying to track this stuff down and other things piece by piece in order to put her life together. So there's a question about what's the status of the archive there. And then finally, how can Moore's archive be a guide for conceptualizing Black radical women's archives in the future? So if the goal here is not just to introduce Moore into the historical narrative, but to create a space where people can do this kind of gendered history of other radical women besides Moore, how might we be thinking about how we collect materials and write about materials differently as scholars, as family historians, as community historians? So I'll start off with a little bit of background on what we now know as Queen Mother Moore. Queen Mother Moore was actually born Audley Moore, the third, one of the oldest of three children of Ella and Saint Cyr Moore. And by and large, she had what we would consider a very charmed life for someone who grew up at the turn of the century during Jim Crow. Her father, who you see pictured here, came up from slavery in the sugarcane fields, became a landowner, became a small business owner. He could afford to keep his wife at home, Ella, who you see here. He could afford to buy a house. He could afford to send Audley and her two younger sisters, Ella and Loretta, to a Black private school in New Orleans. So it's interesting that Moore is an unlikely advocate of Black nationalism. She's an unlikely advocate of Black freedom movement struggles in general, because as she reports even herself, she was raised to be, and these are her words, not mine, a bourgeois little stinker, meaning someone who was meant to buy into white middle class and upper class ideals, to aspire towards whiteness, and to look down upon those people who are poorer than her. This is what her family was teaching her by her own record. So it's a really interesting juxtaposition to think through how somebody that grew up like this ends up being one of the foremost Black nationalists of the 20th century. But her life changed drastically when she's orphaned. Both Ella dies first, and then her father, St. Cyr, dies. And it plunges her basically down the class ladder. She is the oldest, like I said, of two other girls that they both had together, and they have to kind of make their way in the world overnight. She had to quit school. she became a domestic worker. And just to give you this kind of juxtaposition, literally one day she had maids and housekeepers and nannies working for her. The next day she is the maid, the housekeeper, and nanny in a white woman's home. That's the kind of the gross juxtaposition she endured. And she becomes politicized not only by the fact that she realizes how quickly can Black people can fall from their fortunes, but also in the rich milieu that is New Orleans, Louisiana in the 1910s and in the 1920s. One of the foremost examples of that is her introduction to Garveyism and the UNIA. So she's introduced to the idea of Black nationalism. And when I say Black nationalism, what I mean is the belief that Black people constitute a separate people, that we are bound together by our shared history of oppression, our shared heritage from Africa, our shared cultural traditions, and that we have the right to be a separate Black nation. And she's introduced to these concepts through Garvey in his visit to New Orleans. And she meets Garvey or goes to New Orleans because of this man here, Josiah Spraggs, who was her first husband. And I love to tell this story of how she joins the Garvey movement because it is kind of the linchpin of her Black nationalist practice. So she says one day in July 1922, she is trudging through the heat of New Orleans. And why is she moving particularly slowly at this point? It's because, as she says, she's got one 45 caliber pistol, which, if you know anything, is not a small gun, in her bra, another one in her pocketbook, and her husband here, Josiah Spraggs, is carrying a briefcase of bullets. And as they're walking into what they call the Longshoremen's Club, picture a two-story building with kind of dark shutters and wood on the corner of a New Orleans street. They're seeing dock workers and domestic workers and other working class Black folks, and they're telling her, he'll speak tonight. He'll speak tonight. What they're referring to is that Marcus Garvey had come into New Orleans, and for the fear of him rousing literally thousands of Black people to action, the government, the local government, the police, and the mayor actually barred him from speaking at the Longshoremen's Club that night. They got Garvey out of jail and was ready for him to speak again. And so everybody was both arming themselves in anticipation of a fight and trying to see if he actually was going to do so. So as Moore tells it, they file into the longshoremen's hall and they put themselves across these bitches. Then all of a sudden, the white police force of New Orleans comes in and they line themselves up, one man per bitch. So everybody's really nervous right now. They're trying to figure out who's going to make the first move, the Black folks or the police. In comes Garvey, starts bounding down the middle of the row of benches and says, my friends, I'm so sorry that I was not able to speak to you last night. At this, the white police officers jump up and threaten to arrest him. The term that they say is that we'll run you in. And at this, Moore says, all of the Black folks in the longshoreman's hall pull out their guns. She always used the finger guns when she was talking about this, right? And yelled in unison, speak, Garvey, speak. Speak, Garvey, speak. And this show of force made the police put their guns away and walk out as she settled in to hear Garvey speak. And so I want to talk about what a transformative moment this was for a Black girl who was down on her luck in the early 20th century in Louisiana. She had seen a white police force, which at this point had largely engaged in widespread and unchecked white supremacist violence, be cowed by Black people in their show of self-defense. And then when she sat down to listen to Garvey, she heard that she was descended from Africa from kings and queens, that she should not be ashamed of her hair, of her skin color, and that the plight of Black people in Cairo was the same as in Canada, which was the same in South Carolina, as the same as it was in Cuba. So he's all of a sudden getting her this analysis of global white supremacy and imperialism. It fundamentally changed her life, and she became a Garveyite then and there. So I was asking, going back to my first couple of questions about what do we know about Moore, but also how do we talk about and write about her and research about her when I said there's no archive with which to tell these stories or to talk about this early period of her life. So I think we should think about it in two ways. What are the political lessons about Black women and Black radicalism that we learn? And what are the archival lessons for doing this kind of gendered history or work? The political lessons are this. Black women came into Black nationalism through all walks of life. I think often if we think about or learn about Black nationalism at all, it's usually perhaps in this Martin versus Malcolm dichotomy. But the reality is that we mostly think of it as a male-dominated political ideology and practice, and that people are kind of radical from the beginning. But that story I just told you tells how anybody could be attracted to Garveyism and Black nationalism because the sense of self-pride and self-assurance that it offered Black folks, right? And that also we should frame women like Moore as thinking people, right? Intellectuals in their own right who chose nationalism amid another options. In 1920s New Orleans, Moore did not lack for organizations to join to fight for Black liberation. There's a vibrant NAACP. There are vibrant women's clubs focusing on Black women in the vote. There are integrationist groups. There are class-based groups. But there is something about Garveyism and the UNIA that is particularly special to her, and that melds with her analysis of the world, and we should understand it as such. Now, thinking about how we write about this and do this kind of history, there's a couple of things that this early period teaches us. As I said, there is no real archive of her life. I have a couple of notes from the Archdiocese of New Orleans and New Iberia, where she got the sacraments. And I have scoured every page of the Negro World, which is Marcus Garvey's newspaper. And I could not find much on her, despite her being a Garveyite through and through. So the one thing I did find after years and years of looking was a point where her husband, Josiah Spraggs, had donated on her behalf to the UNIA movement. So sometimes we're looking for these one-to-one comparisons that can't happen, but money is one way we can talk about that. And then second thing is here is that world building matters, even 20th century historical actors. Sometimes we think that because we should have these kind of hands-on records that we don't need to think about how to talk about the world at which these women inhabited. But in the absence of hardcore evidence of their day-to-day lives and tracking, it can be a real way for us to understand not only what it was like to be a Black woman in this time, but the important choices young Black women and girls were making. Once she becomes a Garveyite, life gets better, but it's still not great because she's in Jim Crow, Louisiana. So Moore and her husband Spraggs, like millions of other Black people, migrate north in the hopes of a better life. In particular, they go to Harlem, which is not surprising because it is where the UNIA was headquartered. Unfortunately for Moore, by the time she gets there, Garvey and his movement have dissipated, in large part because he was deported in 1927. But there's an organization there that has really taken its place, and it's the Communist Party. So sometimes this is shocking to people, but when I share the two reasons why the Communist Party was popular, it begins to make a lot more sense. This is the Depression, right? So 27, 28, 29, 30. Part one is that as the economy is crashing, Black people feel the depression twice as hard as anybody else. And the Communist Party is there day by day doing the work of helping working class and poor Black people. When they get put out because they've been evicted because they can't pay the rent, the Communist Party comes and puts their furniture back in. They advocate for fair wages. They advocate for childcare. They advocate for health care. They stand outside of butcher shops in Harlem and make sure that Black women and white women are not getting the same price for their meat, for example. So if you're a young Black woman looking for a place to go, this is a group that is organizing on behalf of Black people every day. But in addition to that, the party astutely captured Garvey's base by articulating what we call the Black Belt thesis. And the Black Belt thesis basically said that Black people in the southeastern United States, as indicated here, where they have the arrow pointing to the Black Belt, are separate people that are bound together by their shared history of oppression, their shared heritage to Africa, their same language and cultural practices. And their exact words is that they constitute a nation within a nation and have the right to secession. So if you're a young Black woman who was energized by Garvey and his ideas of Black nationalism, and then you find this group that by day is helping Black people survive, and on a larger scale is saying that, chiming in with these kind of nationalist ideas, you think it's a great organization to join. She called it a quote vehicle that she could go to. And she wasn't alone. This was also a place where Black women enjoyed relative freedom in terms of organizing that they could not in organizations, say, like the NAACP. And she joined a cohort of Black women who she called very serious and who wanted more than, say, two-party politics could give them, and organized on behalf of folks across the nation, but particularly in Harlem for several years. And she rose in the ranks of the Communist Party. By World War II in the 1940s, she is at the head of the Black Popular Front. As many of you know, by the time that World War II comes around, we are in an ardently anti-Hitler, anti-fascist moment. So it is difficult for the Communist Party to maintain this idea that they've got this critique of American state and American capitalism. Instead, they move a little bit towards the center and articulate what we would call maybe a progressivism or a populism that incorporates the idea that you're fighting for fascism abroad, but also against Jim Crow and racism at home. And Moore finds a home here. One of the things that's really interesting about this time of life is that she is a member of the Communist Party, elects the first Black man, who is also a communist, Benjamin Davis, to the city council in New York. Why is this a particularly important feat? Because even though Davis is a Black man who was known around Harlem, he could not be elected to the council unless all five boroughs had a majority. So she was running basically a campaign that covered, the entirety of New York City. She also joined groups like the National Council of Negro Women, what we would call club women or upper class women, voting and civil rights groups, and other groups that were organizing for voting rights, anti-lynching legislation, and for an end to fascism abroad. They were part of this double V campaign. So we see just as the world moves kind of more centered during World War II, so too does Audley Moore. So I think this is an interesting moment to kind of stop again and think about what this means. One of the things that was most shocking to me when I was researching this period of her life was how does somebody that is a dyed-in-the-wool Black nationalist all of a sudden be joining people that seem very, conservative or at the very least progressive in terms of their politics. So it taught a couple of important things. One is that a group does not need to be explicitly, outwardly nationalist to allow members to express their nationalist commitments. One of the things I learned from reading and writing and researching about her is that she felt that ideas like community control, self-determination, and self-defense, and by self-defense, I mean not only armed self-defense as she practiced in New Orleans, but self-defense in the sense of, say, a woman's reputation, right? Or a woman's right to do something. She felt that she could express in these organizations. She was tactical and flexible in the sense that as long as she found enough kind of, coalition or synergy, she felt that she could organize in these groups without losing her nationalist edge. If anything, she used them to kind of push themselves further to the left. Also, organizing principles should not stand in for historical actors' principles, especially when doing Black women's history. So that means also that when we're organizing and writing and thinking about Black women in this time or any other time, not to take whatever the organization's banner for what they say to be the actual political thought and analysis of the women within them. And I think someone like a nationalist and a communist joining progressive organizations really helps us think that. So in this moment, when many historians felt that Audley disappeared from the record, they just weren't looking in the right place. She just moved into different spaces, still doing this different kind of work. And then after she goes through the World War II, as many of you know, then we get to the rise of McCarthyism. There's a huge backlash against being in the Communist Party, and it goes from a space that seems relatively open to one that, leads to basically persecution and jail time. This is also a moment because the Communist Party is under such persecution that they drop those ideas of the Black Belt thesis and Black self-determination before. Audley feels particularly betrayed by this and decides that she should redouble her efforts at the grassroots level. Her and her sisters go back to New Orleans, where they start a new organization and found the modern reparations movement. This organization, located in New Orleans in the late 1950s, is called the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women. And you can see what Moore is doing there. She went back to the place where she found Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association. And by setting up shop there, she's signaling to those people who would still be nationalists, who would still be Garveyites, that this is the kind of organization that follows those ideals. And it's located in New Orleans. And I love talking about this particular group because it's positively astounding the amount of impact they had for maybe a band of 15 to 20 middle-aged Black women in the Deep South. And just for reference, this is the group that original article that I wrote at the Clayman Center was about, and what really got me kind of amped up about writing about Audley Moore. So by day, this group saves Black men on death row in Louisiana. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that they are taking trips to Angola prison, which is about 2 hours away by car. And they are seeing that there are Black men who are on death row, set to die in the electric chair on the alleged charge of raping white women, which they know not to be true. But these men have not had any due process, and they are set to die relatively soon. They then are driving back to New Orleans or other towns in which the men were convicted and literally conducting interviews and uncovering new evidence that calls into question the jury's conviction of them. In one case, they found somebody was actually with the man that they said in the moment that they said that the alleged act occurred. And this caused for a stay of execution when they presented it to the judge. So there are the moments when they're literally saving men's lives, sometimes hours to days before they are set to die in the electric chair. They also are some of the first people to really advocate against Black women's sexual assault. They argued that while these men were on death row for charges that they did not commit, meanwhile, many white men were roaming free while they were, in fact, committing assault against Black women and girls. They brought these different cases to the attention and sometimes forced the district attorney to bring charges to these men. And then finally, as part of an effort to basically starve the Black people of Louisiana, in 1960, Louisiana made a man in the home law on welfare. Welfare was given out, but they said if you had any man in your home, meaning that it could be a brother, a nephew, an uncle, you were then therefore not able to get your welfare check. And we all know that plenty of times people have different borders in their home, different family members in their home. That does not mean that they are in need, not in need of state support. But this was basically a way for them to kick off more Black women than white women off the welfare rolls to the tune of 23,000. So Audley Moore went day by day and city by city, driving to pick up different food to help these women who had been kicked off these welfare rolls. And this was, lest you think this is not dangerous work, in the book, I tell a story about how she was actually shot at as she was driving with her stuff from one city to the other after she went on a speaking tour. So this discussion of the UAW was not enough in and of itself, these kind of game-changing organizing that they're doing as a set of Black women in the Deep South. But in addition to that, whenever they are organizing, they are connecting it to the larger ideals of Black nationalism. What do I mean by that? While they are going out and advocating for the fact that these Black men are on death row, while she is going and asking for donations of canned food for these Black women who have been kicked off the welfare rolls, Moore never misses a moment to connect it to the failure of the American nation state to take care of Black people. And she starts to ask people, why are we continuing to engage in such a political project when it's clear at this point, nearly 100 years after slavery, that this is not designed, nor is it ever going to be designed with Black people in mind. So much so that they begin drafting the idea of a separate Black nation. And by drafting it, I mean they create a pamphlet in 1960 that talks about how we would organize ourselves as a separate Black nation. So this is a moment in the 1950s where Black people, by and large, are looking towards integration, right? We're getting to the rise of the sit-in movement. We're a couple of years away from the March on Washington and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So while all this is going on at the national level, you've got more organizing for Black folks to move in an entirely different direction. In addition to that, she is also starting the modern reparations movement. This group of women, while they are sitting and talking, have realized that there can be no way forward for Black people on equal footing without a true apology and remuneration for not just the years of slavery that we endured, but also the years of psychological, mental, social, economic, everything you can think of, degradation that Black people have experienced since slavery. So here they're in the early 60s, so from 1865 to 1965. They begin the process of organizing for what we would now call the modern reparations movement. And while reparations, whether you agree with it or not, is something that at least you have a reference point for, you understand what we mean by that, and we can debate the merits of it. This was really an entirely new concept at the end of the 1950s and early 1960s. So the idea that this group of Black women was going around and advocating for this, telling people to petition the government for this, telling people to petition the government for it in order for Black people to create a new nation was really quite radical at the time. So when people talk about reparations today and the fabric that it is, it really starts here with this group of Black women in New Orleans. And here is where this was the first pamphlet that she developed. So Moore and her compatriots, they went from city to city, talking to any civic group, any church, any group that would listen. And she would say, you know, you need to get your reparations. We're coming up on the 100th anniversary of emancipation, and we don't have any sort of repayment for this. Even if you are into integration, even if this is what you want, you cannot integrate into a nation state that has not fully understood and made you whole as a human. And it took fire across the country. We have some evidence where there are groups in Los Angeles who are selling this very pamphlet that you see on the screen and talking about how we need to file a claim to the American nation state for integration. You have other groups in San Francisco who took up Moore's claim and then decided that it should be the seed money to start a separate Black nation. But wherever they were, it was kind of a situation of letting a million flowers bloom. And Moore, being the kind of very flexible tactician that she was able to say, I'm going to plant the seed everywhere and you take it up as you see fit. And so this is why we call her the founder of the modern reparations movement. By the 1970s, so again, this is astounding because she's done all of this and we're only to the 70s. She is an internationally known figure. And she becomes basically an elder statesman of the Black liberation movement. Here, stateside, she is becoming the mentor to groups that would be known to be part of the Black Power movement, the Black Panther Party in the Northeast United States in New York, the Revolutionary Action Movement in Philadelphia. I tell the story in the book of her Philadelphia home being a training ground for Black young organizers, and even folks like Malcolm X coming by, sitting down and listening to what she had to say. This time period in which the Black Power movement is developing is also a really interesting moment in African liberation struggles. Day by day, almost it felt like through the 1960s, Black African nations were decolonizing either by force or, you know, under somewhat peaceful circumstances. And so it was a moment when Black people really felt like Black nationalism, right? Black people running their Black nation state was very possible and very feasible. And who had been the advocate for how to do this? Who had been the advocate for creating connections between Africa and America for the better part of 50 years? It was Queen Mother Moore. And so she became the guest to heads of nations across Africa, from Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, to Sekou Touré in Guinea, to Idi Amin in Uganda. And she ended up taking about 7 or 8 different trips to Africa in the latter part of her life. And is at this moment that she starts to become, you know, a queen mother. And by that, I mean she's formally installed as a queen mother in Ghana in 1972. This is a formal ceremony among the Ashanti tribe. But she's also seen as somebody that is a mentor and an elder. And Moore plays on this by beginning to take on, right, both the persona, but also the kind of the physical manifestation, as you see here, of a queen mother, of someone that is of African descent and is respected across the African continent and here in America, right? And I would say one more thing about this too. What is really interesting here is that by the 1970s, at this point, you know, if you think about anybody who is a leader in the Black liberation movement, you think about it largely as a young Black man's game. But being a queen mother allowed Moore to stay present and central and have a seat at the table. Because she inhabited this kind of elder status that was then anointed by a very traditional and old African tribe, she was able to always have a seat at the table versus being pushed out through sexism. She was also never seen as a threat, perhaps like younger activists were, because she was a mother and an elder, not somebody that was going to take over, right, their movement. So what does this tell us about how we should understand the politics again, and then also thinking through how to do this kind of history or this kind of work? So it warns against an oversimplification of Black nationalism and more specifically Garveyism. Thinking about groups like the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women, that group in New Orleans, they were reformulating and rethinking about Black nationalism and Garveyism, even when it was immensely unpopular to do so. So it not only shows the enduring impact of Black nationalism and Garveyism, but it also doesn't reduce it only simply to Black male-led organizations. It also offers another way to think about the evolution of Black nationalism, and one where you cannot tell the story of this in the 20th century without women like Queen Mother Moore and the myriad group of folks that she worked with, but also women-led organizations like the UAEW that I spoke about. On the other side of things, to kind of understand and write about this with rich detail, we've got to think through what constitutes our archive differently. One of the things that is really important to think about is the record through COINTELPRO. The United States government and the FBI followed Queen Mother Moore from the 1920s to the 1970s. Her FBI file is voluminous, so it predates the rise of COINTELPRO and goes all the way through it. And so it offers both really valuable information about her, sometimes perhaps the most complete archive of her that exists, but something also that we have to use with suspicion because of the unethical and predatory nature of it. But it does expand our archive and helps us think through what constitutes an archivist or an elder archivist. We also have to expand our understanding of what constitutes an archive. A lot of what I have found and I write about in the book in this latter period of her life is things that people would maybe not necessarily see as useful work. A perfect example is the amount of poetry that she wrote. This poetry is, I'm going to tell you guys, it's not good. She loved to write poetry, not a good poet. She also loved to sing, not a great singer. But it does offer these insights because most of the time it's just scribbled on the back of a piece of paper while she's in the middle of a boycott or a protest, right? And it's in the archive, that's never going to be labeled Queen Mother Moore poem. That's not where it is, right? You find it by searching around where you think she might be and seeing what kinds of things that you unearth in that way. And then finally, thinking about a person whose life, transpires or goes past their younger years, and thinking about what kinds of groups, communities that we would find somebody in the later years of their life. She had the good fortune of surviving through a lot of these really hard periods of time as a Black radical activist. And so it's important for us to think about her as an elder activist as much as it is a young activist and treat her life with the same kind of rigor. So if we step back more broadly and think about what should we understand about how to do this kind of work, I think it's important to think about our current relationship and the power dynamics in the archive. And it helps us understand why it was so hard to track down more and also maybe port to how we can more ethically do this work in the future. So some of us like to think about the archive and its power dynamics in these three ways. There's the temple, right? A very sacred space that houses records deemed worthy of preservation. Here, this makes me think of, say, a university archive, right? There's the idea of a restaurant where a researcher goes, sits down, picks something off the finding aid menu, and then the work takes place in the archival kitchen of kind of putting that together. And then there's also the prison model where records are locked away and researchers are surveilled, right? So when we think about that no archive is neutral, and we think about how these archives are built or not built to hold the work of folks and the lives of folks like Moore, I think these power relationships where we see about what we deem as worthy, who gets surveilled and access to these archives, and who is really putting these pieces, these artifacts together for us to build these lives, these kinds of models help us think through that. And also, we want to think about perhaps overlaying that with what the state of the Black radical women's archive is in this morning, right? In this moment. So now more than ever, there are more collections devoted to Black radicals and organizations. That is quantifiably true from, even 10 years ago, which is great. But these still are largely organized around great men. So we're still always going to miss the kind of women-centered structures that are still available. A perfect example, again, being a group like the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women, which, none of their stuff is collected in any kind of formal archive, the same way, say, I think if a group of men were doing that, right? The other thing is to think about what we might call the disciplining structures of the archive that are overlaid here. So archives in general, as we talk about them in the United States, were meant for nation building, right? Archives have a nationalist origin in themselves. We take the idea from the principle of provenance, meaning that, we organize where it was from or where its origin was, and a respect de fond, right? This is all a French organized system that we translated when we were trying to develop American empire, as it were. And so the point here is that we're always trying to organize things from kind of their origin and create origin studies. But radical Black archives are not really organized that way. They can't be because they're usually created in response to political moment rather than to reify the political structures that we develop and organize. So we have this mismatch here of how to even organize this stuff, what to organize and prioritize, and then how to make it legible. So we understand now that not only do we have this bias of just kind of what's important, but how we organize it. And as long as those kinds of things are in place, women like Moore are always going to fight through the cracks because they're always creating kind of politically responsive archives and they're unruly and they're biased and they're here and they're there and they're everywhere. They cannot be contained. But in essence, the archival structure that was created and that we abide by was built on the idea of America that did not include Black people in it. So not only is it difficult to talk about Black life adequately through the archival structures that we have, but how do you talk about people who are actually enemies of the state in that sense, right? So I have thought about a new theory of radical archiving that I think perhaps can help us better get at that approach. And I call it the disorderly distributed archive. And here I'm talking about the phenomenon in which the documentation of Moore's ideas, but you can insert any radical Black woman's ideas and approaches, are located everywhere and spread across multiple archives, right? So back to that original slide about being curiously absent from history, my argument here is that she's not absent at all. It's just that it's not organized and legible in the ways that the American nation state and therefore American society expect to encounter somebody's life. But the problem with this that we've encountered is that far too often the geography of the archive, the literal layout of where all of these things are, has come to represent Moore herself. And so she is often framed, if she is talked about at all, as disjointed in her theories, disarray, moving around to all these different things that I told you about because of the disorderly distribution of her evidence. So again, the idea of the geographical location of the evidence comes a stand-in for the woman's ability to think or their importance themselves. So how might we do this differently or think about this differently now that we know that such a thing can be done and that it's important sometimes to understand or navigate this disorderly archive? So one thing that historians or folks that are doing this kind of history need to think about is how do we organize artifacts that foregrounds promotes the political imagination of those it perseveres, right? Is a more orderly collection or disorderly distribution a better approach? If it's the latter, how do we move from understanding it as one of an unevenly arranged purpose, excuse me, and then also things about thinking about the vulnerability of archives and the accessibility of archives. These questions have come up when I have brought up this idea of disorderly distribution because everybody says, well, just put it back in the order that it's supposed to go in now that you've found it all. But I think there are real pitfalls in organizing Black women's archives, and particularly Black radical women's archives that way. And so these questions that I'm bringing to the fore about, is this the best way for Black folks to encounter more, anybody to encounter more in this kind of organizedly, neatly fit archive? Is there value in finding more in conversation with the places and the people that she were? So finding what she does in San Francisco, finding what she does in New Orleans versus putting it all in one central location. And also, how does this affect, like I said, the vulnerability and accessibility of these archives? It's certainly harder to piece lives together when they are all not in one place. So I think that I will end here with some conclusions and invitations based on this fact. So one of the things that I think we should take away from Queen Mother Moore is that she was always questioning modes and expressions of power. And she was always creating new ideas about how Black people should organize themselves outside and inside the confines of white structures. So one of the things that I think we should think about going forward in her life and others is what if we brought that same ethic to her archive and other radical Black women's archives? And how might this help scholars imagine a new way of collecting and writing histories of women like her? I don't purport to have all the answers, but I think one of the most imaginative and wonderful things about Queen Mother Moore is that she taught me to keep my political imagination broad. And I think that political imagination certainly applies to the real world, but also how we write usable and accessible histories. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is amazing and a tour de force, just incredible. I mean, the book is incredible and broad, but so was the talk. So it gives a very nice impression of what it's like to read this book. I did before. There's still some Q&A sort of trickling in, but I thought I'd abuse my position as being
Yeah.
the mouthpiece of the Q&A to ask about um so you've emphasized the distributedness of this archive and
Mhm.
the kind of the difficulties of retrieving it. I when reading it, I noticed that I kind of knew where the house she was living in Philadelphia was, and I think it doesn't even exist anymore. I think it's like either the rail yard or right next to the rail
Mhm.
yard,
Mhm.
essentially. And so like and I compare that to like other biographies where you could probably like walk through the person's
Mhm.
house and
Mhm. Mhm.
whatever. And yet the book it tells such a coherent, even though multifarious and very attentive story.
Mhm.
And I guess I wanted to sort of hear a little bit about your techniques. How does one? So I agree with you about the framing around distributed archives in this way and reading for these absences. But how did you actually do it? Because like in the end, like the difficulty that you lay out, it's
Yeah.
evident here, but it's not. It doesn't seem to have hamstrung the book one bit. What methodologically can you give our audience to sort of carry forward?
Yeah, so just to go back to that point about the poems, say that I briefly touched on, right? Like I said, I never in my life found a folder with an art with a title that said Queen Mother Moore poems, right? What I knew was that, she was in a general area doing a thing. In that case, let's say like the 1966 boycotts for community control over Black schools, right? So the goal here is kind of just to look in that general area, right? And see and not presume at any point that anything that you open up does not include her, right? You almost have to go into it with expecting to find things so that you don't overlook or put aside something. So yeah, I was looking through just like boycott flyers, and just flipping one to the other. And then on the front, it looks like a flyer for the boycott. On the back, her hand written, right? She's writing it and it says written at 12:01 p.m. while, sitting on hour 5 of the boycott. So I think there's a real sense that you have to have a kind of dogged suspicion that she's everywhere, right? And a stay-itness to know that you can find her. But it isn't going to be easy, right? In that sense.
Yeah. That's great. Sorry, I hope people can't hear that there's a man with a leaf blower outside of my window. He
We
always
can't hear it at
shows up.
all. We can't hear it
Always
at all.
shows up when we do
Yeah, I
events
know. Oh,
here.
stop it.
I think he's here just to torture me. Uh, well, the other thing that came up in the Q&A was the question of sort of like um, counter narratives and counter lives. Right there's these interesting more seems to have like there's always sort of existing in your narrative like against these very large operations and well documented
Mhm.
operations
Mhm.
of power. Right.
Mhm.
So the man the house laws
Mhm.
that she's fighting against are what's going to sort of drive the whole Moynihan report,
Mhm. Exactly.
rollback of
Mhm.
welfare and the kind of problematization of the black family. Um, COINTELPRO, obviously.
Mhm. Mhm.
What was the ethics and balancing the fact that you probably had a surfeit of evidence on
Mhm.
one side, and then
Mhm.
these things that you had to sort of really
Mhm.
retrieve and find care and sort of excavate, as you say, with
Mhm.
this almost like Dragnet is putting it very negatively, but sort of looking
Yeah,
out
yeah,
and
yeah,
trying to
yeah.
figure out like, is she here? Is she here? Is she here?
Mhm.
How does one ethically sort of
Yeah.
combine that? Because of course the easiest thing is always to go to power, and power
Mhm.
will have something to offer,
Mhm.
but it's not. But then you're not telling the real story.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a couple of things. Like I said, you've got to world build. So I mean, for example, taking her whole girlhood, besides what her family, her father was doing. The fact of I know when she's born, she didn't even have a birth certificate. I only know she was born because of the Catholic Church, right? Logging the sacrament.
Right.
But there's a whole kind of early girlhood where there isn't much evidence of anything to do. So there you have to engage in, kind of, I would say, like informed imagination, where I said, okay, well, what was it just like to be a girl in New Orleans? I've got to find other accounts of that. I've got to go down there and look and see if I can see the buildings, see the school, the roads that her horse and buggy would have traveled, anything and everything. And you have to become a student of that world as though you can inhabit it. And sometimes that truly means going there and walking the streets, especially in a place like New Orleans where it might still be available, even if the structures aren't. And you just you informed imagination. You say, this is what it
Mm.
could have been, this is what it would have been like. In other instances, like you said, I mean, the FBI file is thorough. For basically the better part of 50 years, agents followed her every single day. And they are not only documenting what meeting she's going to. They've tapped her phone, so everybody she's talking to in that process. But what's really astounding about it is they're also kind of their own archivist in and of themselves. There are many moments when they've cut out the newspaper articles featuring her for that day in whatever random city she was in and put them in the FBI file, as well
Oh,
as
nice.
right? So, on the one hand, and for radical Black women like Moore and the others that I study, sometimes this is the most complete accounting of their life, right? Is through state power and the FBI. So certainly we have to take that with a grain of salt because they're obviously, intent to ensnare and defame them. But, it does point you in some directions. I might never know that she was in Alabama in 1946 if they hadn't cut out that image,
Right.
right? But then you go down there and say, okay, what was it like to be this person there? So there's a way in which, the surveillance is kind of going up from her up to Hoover, but there's a way in which, as a historian, you can kind of push that back down and say, okay, I know she was here on the ground here. I know from the meeting, right? I know the meeting house she went to, right? I can at least kind of imagine it or try to find other accounts of what that place might have looked at and kind of reverse that power to offer you a story of what it's like on the ground.
Did you have a favorite sort of mo place that you had to go to and you're like, I can't believe I'm here?
So she was technically born in New Iberia, which is about 2 hours outside of New Orleans. And so I go there probably once a year for many years while I was researching. And then just a kind of shameless plug for them, they have this wonderful community history group there that has resurrected her memory, put up a marker, has a whole center where you can learn Black history there. So been working with them for years, but when you're trying to like walk the path and like find the plot of land based on where would be, you're like, wow, I'm really, really in it. The other thing is that I spent a lot of time in writing the first part of the book. I lived in Louisiana for a summer, and New Orleans was my home base, but I would drive to these outlying parishes to be in their county records office to try to find land deeds, try to find marriage, anything that helped me figure out her family and her life. And most of the time, these things are in French and Spanish, right? And they're in the bottom of a
Yeah.
basement. In incredible luck, I was a French and Spanish major in college because I do so much with that now. But an incredible stroke of genius in that way. But I kid you not, sometimes they would just lead me down. There maybe be three people in that courthouse. I'd be in the basement and I would just open these records and like, the dust that I swear must have come from like plantation era Louisiana fell on me. So it really is it's a labor of love in that way.
Mm. So we have a question from Estelle Friedman who first thanks you for
Well,
the wonderful talk and is very excited to read the book and
yeah.
wanted to sort of come back to this question, the value of this dispersed archives
Hmm.
and about the question of digitization of
Hmm.
varied collections, how it kind of allows for both local and broad accessibility to the lives and ideas of women like Moore.
Hmm.
What's your sense of that?
Yeah, well, first of all, hi, Estelle. Secondly, is dissertation is an interesting moment. There is no doubt that having a digitized record can help prevent, and make an important set of documents less vulnerable. I am less convinced about the accessibility of said things
Mm,
as we continue to put them all behind paywalls like ProQuest or something else, for example, right? And I am somebody who is, I mean, this book could not have been written, right, without digitized archives and without digitized Black newspapers, right? I mean, so there's really important work. The ability to search through a ton of newspapers at once is invaluable when you're trying to track somebody day by day. But that privilege to only be able to do that because I work at a school that is paid the fee to be able to access that is a different set of problems and is really antithetical to the kind of politics and work that Moore was engaged in. So I do think digital records are an important part of making sure we don't lose this history. I would love to see us as historians and academics advocate for broader accessibility to those things because otherwise we're recapitulating the kind of forms of power and vulnerability that I talked about.
that's great. Another question. So I feel like this came up in your talk, and I just
Mhm.
thought I'd ask you to be even more explicit about it. The international kind of aspect of Moore's life um, clearly makes her is part of that eligibility that you're talking
Mhm.
about. The fact
Mhm.
that she's just not committed to kind of a national restoration project through
Yeah.
justice, but rather she can take it or leave it.
Mhm.
Um, how does that complicate things? What were the sort of narratives that you sort of saw your project running up against that made her this kind of, yeah, not outlier figure, but a figure that sort of the narrative wasn't primed to capture, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the question, at the end of this life that, I mean, if you get the book, you're reading 150 years of history, right? And this incredible life. And the question is like, what do you take from it? I mean, certain things that she advocated for, like reparations, have become relatively mainstream, right? I mean, there's stuff in state houses today about that. This idea of creating a separate Black nation on U.S. soil, right? While, if you see in the book, some people tried it to varying levels of success, is still considered, I mean, an incredibly outside the box thing, right? But that is your goal. So is this a story of triumph in the end? Because we like, particularly our Black history and our civil rights stories, to be stories of triumph, right? Where we've been in the storm so long and we're done, and then finally we get to this moment where the American nation state really includes us. She starts with the premise that that is never going to happen. And builds her life and tries to orient people in a different direction. So it is not your traditional Black freedom movement narrative because of that. But it also is a moment where, even if you may not believe necessarily in what she was preaching, it is a real model in how to stay the course as an activist, right? I mean, when you think about how much of different parts of American history that she survived, and not only survived, but thrived through her coalition building, sometimes making strange bedfellows. Throughout the book, she questions sometimes if she's gone too far away from her
Mm.
ideals and back in that. Sometimes she absolutely portrays her ideals, and it was heartbreaking to write, right? I was like, oh my God, I can't believe she's doing this. So I say that to say is that it is not a traditional happy ending narrative. I leave it up to readers to decide if the stick-to-itness and the stay-itness and the successes that she did have feels like it was a life worth living or not.
Mm. And maybe as a final question, we have a
Mhm.
great question here about the question of age. I mean, it's just
Mhm.
a long life, and it's a long book
Mhm.
about a long
Yeah,
life,
yeah.
and about her sort of role as a mother figure, in the sort of
Hmm.
latter half of her life,
Hmm.
um, helped her maybe have a more important role in movements
Hmm.
that more easily than, let's say, a younger Black woman might have. And
Hmm.
like what the factor, how age and political activism interact in the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, we like our Black freedom movement figures young, male, and stuck in time, right? And by that I mean, even if somebody who fell before their time, like a Martin Luther King, she didn't leave past March on Washington, right? Let alone the kind of evolution of his thinking. She defies all of that, which I think is in part why she has not been the subject of many historical narratives. But I think, like I said, she was a smart woman. She knew that the world was changing and that, folks were always like a Malcolm or a Huey Newton or somebody was always going to get more due. But by kind of, like I said, inhabiting this queen mother role, she wasn't a threat as like a partner. She wasn't a threat as an equal. And she wasn't a threat as somebody that was going to usurp your power.
Right, right.
So, and I think she knew that, right? She that was her gender analysis. She was like, all right, if I want to stick in this, I know that this is, but you will never disrespect an elder, right? You would never disrespect, an elder statesman of the movement. And so she was in fact that, but she leaned into that because I think that allowed her a seat at the table in other cases where they would have said, you're too old, that's old, we don't need to know about that, et cetera. So, she was an astute organizer and she understood that.
Well, wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ashley, again for this incredible talk and for this incredible book. I really can only sounds like from the Q&A that some people have not yet purchased it and read it, which is I don't hold against you, but you should rectify it post haste because it's excellent. I learned so much, and I also can't wait for the next book. I have to say,
Thank you.
as I was writing the intro, I was like, Oh, I wish we could already have that book also, because I'd love to read that as well. Thank you for everything you do, and thank you
Thank
for
you.
your amazing work, and thank you for coming back to Clayman for
Yes,
this.
no, thank you for planting the seeds that help this book grow.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming.